Welcome back to Cruder.com. In this next video on math formulas, we're going to solely be going over the subtotal formula. Let's get started. Now we're back to the same table, May invoices, and you can see it's separated by invoice number. And each invoice might have multiple products that the customer had purchased. So then it tells us the price of the product, the quantity that they purchased, and then the extended price. And at the bottom it subtotals everything together. And it doesn't use a sum formula, but we could have used a sum formula to do this. Now I want to first start off by the misconception that the sum formula is the same thing as the subtotal formula. And just notice here that the sum formula, it says it adds all of the numbers in a given range. But the subtotal formula says it returns a subtotal in a list or a database. So it doesn't explicitly say that it adds or sums anything together in a subtotal formula. When we go ahead and look at the arguments that it's asking for in the subtotal formula, you can see that it's average and count and max and min. All these things can be chosen to be subtotaled in that type of a fashion. So if you choose sum, it's going to be basically the sum formula. But there are a couple differences to the sum formula versus this sum function. Now I'm going to put a comma to get myself into these reference cells. So I'm going to reference this subtotal and close it up. And you can see that it returns the exact same thing as it did here. But what if I go ahead and change it from 9 to max, which is 4? So that would return instead this number right here, because that is the highest or most expensive line item that we have in this table. Now you're probably asking, why would I ever want to use the subtotal formula to then find the max of something when I can just simply use the max formula and grab all of the numbers and then close it up? It equals the exact same number, right? Well, what if you needed to look at an entire list and you had subtotals through it, and you didn't want to look at any of the subtotals when you're looking at the max because you truly just want to know the line totals, not the subtotal? Obviously the subtotal would be the highest number. So let's grab the subtotal line here, the 6,000. So you'd think that this would be picked up, but it's not. But if we have this formula, the max, and then we pick up this one, it will be. So that's the subtle difference using subtotal and sum or count or max as we did right here. Now you're probably wondering what the include hidden versus exclude hidden means. So let's go ahead and let me show you what the difference is. If I copy this formula and paste it down here, now you can see that 4 is something, it's called max, but 104 is also called max. So let's use 4 and 104. And let me just label it here, so 4104 just as a reference. Now the difference is literally it's going to include hidden cells in the calculation, but in this one it's not going to look at any of the hidden cells when it calculates the max in the range. So if I take that max number right here on line 14 and right click and hit hide, one of them sees it. It's this one, it's including hidden cells, but this one doesn't see it. So it says the next highest row is 999.98, which is this one for the 2 pallets. And right here, this is how you go ahead and manually use the subtotal formula. Now we don't need to manually always type it. There's a built-in Excel function for subtotaling. So I'm going to open up the ribbon with Control and F1 and go to the data tab on the ribbon, and in this outline section you can see there's a subtotal button here. It says it quickly calculates rows of related data by inserting subtotals and totals. So it will already do what we want it to do. So let's just use this function by selecting our table and clicking, and then the dialog box will appear for us to follow the instructions to make the subtotaling happen. So if we start here at the top, it says at each change in, and it lists all of the columns. So every time it sees a change in my invoice, that's where I want to subtotal. So it's talking about this column right here. Once it sees this break from 11 to 12, it's going to put the subtotal. And what type of function do I want it to use in the subtotaling? And you can see it's the same list that we saw in the subtotal function itself: summing, counting, averaging, max, min, and the rest. So we're going to use sum because that would make most sense to sum up all of the lines on an invoice. The next thing it goes into says, hey, what do you want us to add a subtotal to? And it lists all of the column labels again. and it makes most sense to go ahead and sum the extended price only. I mean, you could also click in here and say quantity as well if you wanted to add up the quantity. Here it's asking about replacing current subtotals. So if you've already put in some subtotals, this will pull those subtotals out and replace it with this stuff. The next thing is actually pretty handy. I use it every now and again when I need to print reports where I need to have a separate page for each individual invoice or whatever that table might be that needs a page break in between things that change. So if you put this in here, if you press print, one page will be this invoice, the next page will be the next invoice, and so forth. I'm going to leave that off. And then the last one is just putting in a grand total to the table. So I'm going to hit OK. And here's the result of that. Now let's go ahead and just analyze what just happened here. As you can see, this first invoice, there's a brand new row for this invoice number. It says the total of it, and it's giving us the actual subtotal. It's written it out, grabbed the perfect range, all three of the items on this invoice, and summed them up. And over to the left, you can see that there's these lines that have been put here for outlining each individual invoice. So if I collapse this, it's just going to leave the subtotal for that invoice. And if I actually just hit the 2, it's going to collapse all of them so that I'm left with this high level overview or outline of all of the invoices. And then at the very bottom, you can see we told it in the dialog box to give us a grand total. And perfect, this grand total equals exactly what we were thinking, 6120 as we calculated earlier. But look at how it's written. It's using subtotal 9 and the range. It has to use subtotal. There's no other way besides selecting individual cells that it can add. So if you use the sum formula by accident and then just sum up the range that it's selecting right now, you're going to get a huge number, and that's because it's not only summing the individual product rows, but it's summing these total rows as well. The last thing I want you to notice is that these formulas we wrote earlier are now looking at this formula using the sum formula. So that's a bad thing, so I want to undo that, Control Z, and get back to this subtotal formula, and now it's looking at all of the values around or surrounding the subtotal formulas in this range right here. And you can see that the excluding hidden is at 0 because there is nothing in this range for it to see. All of these are subtotal formulas, as you can see here. But the other one that has the 4 in there as the subtotal function is looking at the hidden cells. So not only is it me right-clicking and hitting hide, it's also within this outlining about having it open or closed. And see, when I opened it, now it sees that 199. That's the maximum it can see.